Good morning. I am Sandra Sander, and I will talk a little about my bachelor's work. Comparison of Estonian and American politicians' marketing communications on Facebook. The study also had an amazing supervisor, Professor Dawn Enniston. Wattenbergs found that 1/3 of voters do not actually know anything about particular politicians, despite having strong emotions towards them. Many people do not stop to investigate platforms. Politicians try to entice them by slogans, and it is suggested that today people vote with their hearts more than with their minds. It has been argued that through the concept of permanent campaign, political marketing has become the organizing principle around which parties and government policies are constructed. It is extremely likely that the values and attitudes modeled by the leader will be taken by voters to represent those of their party. Certain leaders are more popular than the policies they stand for. And also it is interesting to know that candidates who are perceived as worse or than much better than the majority of people are rejected by voters. The first are discarded for obvious reasons, and the latter because they are too different from every man. This is also why populists are doing so great. Political marketing has been criticized from ethical standpoints as undermining democracy because of its ability to promote populism and people with bright appearances and to manipulate and mislead the voter. It should be stressed that political marketing is not an ideology, and it is not related to a particular ideology more than it is to another. Political marketing may be used for various purposes and is not itself a threat to democracy. The real threat is the intention of people who decide to use it. One of the fundamental promotion strategies is the strategy of negating the campaigning. Staging a direct or indirect comparative assault against the position of opponent and/or their personal characteristics. But negative advertising should be used only as last resort because it might produce a backlash. Negative information is figural against a positive background, and people are more strongly motivated to avoid costs than to approach gains. Law also points out a mechanism of motivational explanation for negativity that is related to the survival of species. It is more adaptive to avoid life-threatening costs than to approach pleasurable gains. This way of appealing to voters has become one of the most frequently used marketing methods. Facebook is now the leading social media channel for both Estonia and for the US. It has arguably become the most powerful political messaging platform in history. Some voters know for a long time who they are going to vote for, and persuasion efforts will inevitably fail in their case. But there are also floating voters who make up their minds during the campaign or just before the act of voting. Because of their behavior is more impulsive than reasoned, it is relatively easy to convince them by particular arguments, but it is much more difficult to reach them because usually they are not interested in politics. Social media could be an effective way to reach voters who are usually not interested in politics. It is also interesting to point out that television viewers will be significantly more likely than audio listeners to use personality criteria when evaluating the candidates. Facebook Live and Facebook video viewers are significantly more likely to use personality criteria when evaluating the candidates than audio listeners or voters who read about the candidate. It could be thought that explaining complex subjects to voters through Facebook posts is shallow, but people use these quick narratives as shorthand devices for simplifying complex subjects. So the study examined the differences between Estonian and American politicians' use of Facebook messaging and their reactions to such messaging. The research approach used conceptual analysis to examine Facebook posts of two Estonian politicians, Kaja Kallas and Jürgen Ligi, and two prominent American politicians, Kamala Harris and Mike Pence. The posts what were examined were from a time period of 1st July from 2020 up to 30th September 2020. Posts were categorized as personal-oriented, competitive-oriented, and policy-oriented. And overall engagement was also recorded. In the competitive-oriented posts, the politician often directly refers to the opposing individual or political party. These posts may also emphasize the flaws and faults of their competition. Posts that use negative advertising are categorized as competitive-oriented posts. Policy-oriented posts where politicians talk about their political agendas or ideologies in policy or ideologies, yes. In personal-oriented posts, the politician talks about their own personal life. They may share photos from childhood, their families or hobbies, and the politician shows themselves as human to empathize with. Also, personal-oriented posts had much more photos and visuals than competitive and policy-oriented posts. So Kamala Harris had 20% of Kamala Harris posts were personal posts, 30% were competitive posts, and 50% of posts were policy posts. American politicians concentrate more on explaining their ideology or policy to their followers. Kamala Harris was fighting for elections. Since many people do not stop to investigate platforms, it could be possible that the smaller word count per one post from American politicians is linked to them focusing more on trying to communicate with voters through slogans. And in the 3-month period, Estonian politicians posted only 57% of the amount of American politicians posted posts. This was one of the factors that was considered when looking at the engagement levels and primary reason for selecting a percentage of posts. So top 15% of engaged posts were selected to see exactly the top engagements by reactions and the top engagements by comments. Instead of raw numbers, for example, top 10 posts or top 15 posts. The findings show that her competitive-oriented posts were much more popular to comment on between the followers. 36% of posts in the most engaged posts by comments were policy-oriented, far less than her overall 50% of policy-oriented posts. Since people are more strongly motivated to avoid costs than to approach gains, it is not surprising that people commented most on competitive-oriented posts. People want to react and get the word in when something is threatening their well-being. Kamala Harris calling Donald Trump a narcissist who will destroy healthcare, which threatens voters' well-being. Even if a voter does not particularly wish to vote for Kamala Harris, they may choose a protest vote against Donald Trump. Estonian politicians Kaja Kallas and Jürgen Ligi posted 1.4 times more personal-oriented posts than American politicians Kamala Harris and Mike Pence. Estonian politicians seem to try to form more personal relationship with their voters. This could be due to Estonia having much smaller population. Plus, Estonian politicians have far less of population to reach, and forming more personal relationship with their voters is potentially more accessible. Since Kamala Harris and Mike Pence have millions and millions of followers, they can't really get this kind of personal relationship with their voters as easily. Estonian politicians Kaja Kallas and Jürgen Ligi also posted 2 times more competitive-oriented posts than American politicians Kamala Harris and Mike Pence. Appealing to voters with negative advertising has become one of the most frequently used marketing methods. It was also very interesting for me to see that Estonian politicians are much more competitive-oriented than American politicians. At first, I figured it would be otherwise. For Kaja Kallas, a whopping 77% of most engaged posts were personal-oriented. And in the top 5% most engaged posts by reactions were all personal-oriented. This finding shows what kind of posts Kaja Kallas followers like to engage with by reactions. Kaja Kallas' most engaged posts by comments were 62% competitive-oriented. Her competitive-oriented posts were much more popular for building a dialogue with followers. There was not one personal-oriented post in the most engaged post by comments, so people don't really start a dialogue about personal topics. In the most engaged posts by reactions, 12 posts out of 13 posts had picture with a post. So personal posts are really more popular if you give them a visual, and people can emphasize more with a visual than with a text. So Jürgen Ligi composed several very long posts on Facebook. The word count for a single post from Jürgen Ligi could be equal to 3, 4, or even 10 posts from other politicians. Estonian politicians Kaja Kallas and Jürgen Ligi posted 1.8 times less policy-oriented posts than American politicians Kamala Harris and Mike Pence. For Jürgen Ligi, the most engaged posts by reactions were personal-oriented, equating to 83.3% of posts. Most engaged posts by comments for Jürgen Ligi in this case were policy-oriented, equating for 42% of posts. Jürgen Ligi's followers were more prone to comment on policy-oriented posts. Mike Pence at the time was defending his role as vice president. Mike Pence was serving under Donald Trump, who is recognized as being very competitive-oriented. Mike Pence could have intentionally decided that his political role as vice president requires him to complement rather than reinforce the president. Mike Pence could be attempting to use his more policy-oriented communications by diluting Donald Trump's aggressive competitive-oriented communications. Negative campaigning often leads to slightly lower feelings of political efficiency, trust in government, and possibly overall public mood. Thus, Mike Pence was working to ensure that the public would not lose its trust in the government. Using negative advertising is also not recommended for representatives of parties enjoying little support in society or those for which support is decreasing. And since the corona pandemic and many other issues, Donald Trump and Mike Pence were losing their popularity. So being extra competitive on top of that is not recommended. For Mike Pence, the most engaged posts by reactions were personal-oriented, which equated to 47% of posts. The most engaged posts by comments, or 84% of posts, were policy-oriented, compared to 71% of overall posts being policy-oriented. In the most engaged posts by reactions, 18 posts out of 19 posts as pictures with a post. Visual images help politicians to brand themselves in a non-verbal way. This can be utilized to get more engagement, especially with personal-oriented posts. Pictures can show politicians' personality in a much intimate and effective way. So overall, Estonian politicians used more text, but post much less frequently than American politicians. Estonian politicians' posts were much more personal-oriented and more competitive-oriented, but they used less policy-oriented posts. American politicians seem to communicate more in a slogan-like manner. And engagement by comments was increased more for Estonian politicians than American politicians for competitive-oriented posts. Engagement by reactions was decreased more for Estonian politicians than American politicians for policy-oriented posts. So could say that Estonian voters are not so interested in policy, more in personal and competitive posts and communication. The research also found that the most engaged posts by reactions typically included an image, not a link, whereas the most engaged posts by comments typically also had a link attached to the post that had extra information, extra topics to discuss about in the comment section. And thank you for your attention.